If you look at how intense this drought is and the fact that it's the second longest duration drought that we have records for, the springs are still flowing and people are still able to use water from the aquifer. And in large part, that's because of a very well thought out, technically defensible groundwater management system that's implemented by the Edwards Aquifer Authority. What is the Edwards Aquifer? Why is it even important? Who cares, right? So it's the primary water supply for a lot of South Texas. So the primary supply for the city of San Antonio, but also for people in much of Comal and Hays County and Medina and Uvalde County. Just would love for everybody to understand the valuable component of our South Texas environment is water. Water is so important to us. Groundwater, surface water, rainwater. You know, we all need to be cognizant of just how important water is to us every day. Our goal and our job in a nutshell is to manage, enhance, and protect the Edwards Aquifer. Hi, my name is Mark Hamilton. I'm Executive Director of Aquifer Management Services at the Edwards Aquifer Authority. So my job and my role is to basically oversee and manage the different groups that work here at the FRP, or Field Research Park, for the Edwards Aquifer Authority. We have 3 different program areas that contribute to that. We have our sustainability team, we have our aquifer science and modeling team, which does a lot of the research and modeling, and then we have a data management team. Collectively, we're able to do a lot of meaningful work to begin and quantify the benefits associated with different land management practices, and it's all focused here on the Field Research Park. So let's talk a little bit about what is the Edwards Aquifer. If we look at this map, you can get a pretty good understanding of where it is and what it is. So the Edwards Aquifer is composed of 3 parts. We have what we call the contributing zone, which is in green at the top. We have a recharge zone in blue. We have an artesian zone that's in kind of a light yellow. Each of those components makes the aquifer system, and it requires each of those components to be as functional as it is. The Edwards is really an interesting system because it's a karst system, and karst is a pretty unique aquifer system. If we look at this map again, we can see the contributing zone is about 3.5 million acres of land. That's huge, and it's critically important to the functionality of the system. So rainfall that occurs in the contributing zone, for the most part, contributes to stream flows that cross the Edwards Aquifer recharge zone. Those streams lose a significant amount of their base flow to the recharge zone, which becomes recharge to the system. The water then gets stored under pressure in the artesian zone, and that's where the majority of wells in the aquifer system exist that supply, for example, the city of San Antonio, but that water also supplies the springs at Comal and San Marcos Springs with flow. So part of the job of the Edwards Aquifer Authority is to manage and regulate this system in a way that everybody can receive a benefit, right? The springs continue to flow during droughts, but our permit holders continue to be able to pump water. Even though we do have a series of cutbacks that come with different drought conditions, we've worked very hard to develop good quality technical defensible approaches to managing the system that benefits everyone equally. So if we think about the map we just looked at, shows the 3 zones of the aquifer system and kind of the extent and how big it is. If we look at that in more of a cartoon fashion, it kind of gives you a better perspective of what does it really look like if you do a cutaway or a cross section of the aquifer. So think of the hill country and the Edwards Plateau as being back here. This is the contributing zone, rain that falls back here, slowly matriculates across the recharge zone located here where the Edwards body of rock is exposed at the surface. That water goes into the aquifer system at the recharge zone and then is later stored, in some cases very deep underground, in the artesian zone, which is the bucket essentially that most of the water comes back out of, either as flow from wells or flow at springs. What is the Edwards Aquifer? Why is it even important? Who cares, right? So it's the primary water supply for a lot of South Texas. So the primary supply for the city of San Antonio, but also for people in much of Comal and Hays County and Medina and Uvalde County. And we have agricultural interests out west that rely on the aquifer. We have industrial and municipal users in San Antonio and in the Medina County area that, in addition to agriculture, there's still, municipal use there. You have the Springs communities in Comal and San Marcos, Comal County and San Marcos, or Hays County. And so the aquifer provides water for agriculture, for municipal use, for industrial use. It also provides water for the springs and the endangered species that live there. So that alone is pretty important, because without it, we wouldn't have the communities that we have, right? They're usually built around water, and it's been a historical big source of water. It's also a really big aquifer. It's about 180 miles from west to east in this segment alone, and there are other segments of the aquifer. The Edwards Aquifer Authority is responsible for managing just that central segment, the Balcones Fault Zone, Edwards Aquifer, which in our case is from Uvalde County all the way up to Hayes County. The aquifer gets, on average, about 700,000 acre-feet of recharge a year. An acre-foot of water is 325,000 gallons, 325,851 to be exact. So that's just a huge amount of water, right? And in a non-drought year, you could say that typically about half of that water flows out the springs, and about half of that water is withdrawn from wells. Our job at the EAA is to manage, enhance, and protect that aquifer system within our jurisdiction. And that's why we have things like a permitting system that regulate the amount of withdrawals. And those withdrawals get regulated so that we can maintain flow at the springs for the endangered species and things like that. But we also monitor the water quality. We do the work we're doing at the Field Research Park. We have an entire regulatory staff that is dedicated to other components of the mission. So there's about 100 people at the EAA. Our group that y'all are meeting with today is about 30 of those people, and we've just got a bunch of great folks that are really engaged and invested in taking care of the system.
So we're standing in front of a very visible example of karst geology, and this is a phrase that a lot of people hear for the first time when they start living in an area with karst geology. What would you say to someone who's trying to wrap their head around what that means?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, karst is a pretty special thing. It really originates with a rock body that's soluble, right, and especially in water. So if you think of this rock body, it's about 65 million years old, and been here a long time. I don't know exactly how long it's been exposed at the surface, certainly not that long, but maybe 30 million years of surface exposure, or 10 million, doesn't matter. It's a long, long time. So when you see it rain, you don't think about, well, rain actually dissolves limestone over time. But if you give that geologic time factor a chance, then it changes the character of this rock. And then that's, in this area, is further augmented, if you will, by, we're in the Balcones Fault Zone right here. So we've had a lot of faulting. All that faulting and movement is also millions of years old. But that offered an opportunity to break up some of the rock, give an opportunity for water to get further into the rock. So think of all the fractures that probably formed from that faulting, and then millions of years of water running through those fractures and expanding them, and then roots doing what roots do and expanding them further, where you're creating new openings for water to go into the aquifer. So what we see right here in front of us, this is part of the Edwards limestone. We're near the bottom of the formation. There's probably another 100 to 150 feet of Edwards limestone below our feet. But this is what we call vuggy rock, so it's got a lot of holes in it. This rock doesn't necessarily have a lot of interconnected holes, which would be permeability, but it has a lot of porosity. It certainly would hold a lot of water, right? And some of those are connected, not all of them. That's one avenue for water to get into the system. Fractures like we have at our feet, that's another avenue. And in a little while, we'll walk down the creek and we'll see a solution feature where a fracture's been enlarged over time, and it's actually capable of taking a fair amount of water into the ground, which is recharge. This whole stream is in the Edwards limestone, and it's a recharging stream. We know that water in this stream disappears into the subsurface and becomes recharge. In fact, 2 days ago, there was about 2 or 3 feet of water where we're standing. You have this little feature that's, there's probably some movement in the rock. If I look around at all these fractures, it kind of makes me think, well, this probably moved around a long time ago, and there was a crack here that expanded over time, maybe with, dissolution, which is typical of karst environments. And, You know, we have video of water going in that, which is pretty cool. It's just a little feature that is probably supported times several thousand throughout the area that takes in water and offers recharge. Things like that perhaps are why this creek dried up in a matter of a couple of days after having water in it on Tuesday. They're extremely responsive to recharge and to drought, and they also don't offer filtration for contaminants when they run off into the system. So that's the beauty and the problem with Karst at the same time. It's super responsive. If we get a lot of big rains, it'll fill up very quickly, and that's great. But it's also responsive to drought. You know, it responds to drought. It's what we call flashy. It's similar in some ways to a surface stream. But it also will take in whatever's entrained in that runoff water that goes into the recharge zone. It only takes a small amount of chemicals like that to contaminate a whole lot of water. So, you know, we're very fortunate in this aquifer system that the water, for the most part, is pretty clean, and it hasn't been heavily impacted yet. But it doesn't take a lot to do a lot of damage, so it's always important to be cognizant of what your actions might cause, right? If it's more convenient for you to pour your oil in the backyard, maybe you should take it to the recycle center instead, because you're going to impact something, whether it's the groundwater or the vegetation or something else. If you have enough organic carbon in your streams, that organic carbon does a good job of capturing and harboring those things that you don't want in your water supply. One of the problems we have in this region is, yeah, we have some vegetation in this stretch of stream, but a lot of our streams are just bare rock, and there's just not a lot of organic carbon content there by nature of how the system works. So it's harder to capture a lot of those different things that can be entrained in a surface runoff and basically keep it in one place and keep it from going in your groundwater.
Would you say that for a fissure feature like this, if a tree were to grow here, let's say like a sycamore tree for a while, that it might enhance this feature when that tree dies and decomposes?
I think it's an active process, and we have it going on all around us, and we have a lot of different things going on in this karst landscape. So we have these little bitty features that we'll see today, but I can show you some pictures of features that are huge. So it varies from small cracks to small solution features to buggy rock to big sinkholes that would allow hundreds of thousands of gallons of water a day to flow directly into the system. So that's kind of the interesting thing to me about karst is it's widely varied. It changes with time. It's impacted by trees, by faulting, by the elements, and it also doesn't really offer a whole lot of filtration. So we talked about that a little bit earlier. You know, it's important to have good water quality flowing into these recharging streams. We know historically that about 80% of the recharge that occurs in the Edwards Aquifer happens inside these streams where you have losing stretches or losing reaches of a stream. So it's a lot of water, and it's our water supply. So we're certainly interested in how healthy it is all the time.
I guess one other thing that I had was just making sure I'm understanding something properly, which is I had heard or I read somewhere that juniper in particular in this area, but other trees wouldn't just be juniper. When it rains, water is making its way down, you know, the root channels that have been created by these trees like juniper, and that creates carbonic acid that starts to slowly dissolve the limestone and open up the water table. And that could be a reason why you would want, especially like rocky hillsides, to remain vegetated with trees that are capable of growing through that rock.
What I've come to learn through the Field Research Park and the work that we've done here and some of the different collaborators that we interface with is woody vegetation has a really important role in the landscape. And one of those is keeping the soil on the landscape. Like on this hillside right here, when we get, like we had almost 7 inches of rain this week, that soil is going to get caught up in that runoff, but these roots here keep the soil in place pretty effectively, and then all the leaf litter and everything else acting as compost. But also there's some good research out there done by some of the folks at Texas A&M looking at infiltration associated with woody species, and there does appear to be some net benefits with regard to infiltration. And I think I would agree with your your statement that those routes probably offer additional pathways and decomposition of the limestone through the development of different acids to expand opportunities for direct vertical infiltration.
So we've talked about how old it is, we've talked about how big it is, we've talked about who relies on it, how fast it recharges, but still trying to create this mental model of what the Edwards Aquifer actually is. Is it a giant underground cave? Is it a giant underground river? Is it just a bunch of rock like we have under our feet, or some of all of the above? Can you help me understand what it actually looks like under there?
You know, there's absolutely areas where there's big caves and big conduits and passageways for water. And then there's areas that probably are just a body of rock that look a lot like the cliff that's behind us, right? That's Edwards limestone. And you could just kind of visualize, well, that's what it looks like in the subsurface. You just can't see it. But, you know, when the aquifer receives recharge, you got to have rain. We've talked about that to the point that probably no one wants to hear about it, but rain in the contributing zone, rain on the recharge zone puts water in the system. But rain on the artesian zone doesn't really impact the water level in the Edwards Aquifer. It might impact a lot of other, like surface streams and such, which is important too. But the aquifer is so big and it's so vast, you know, if it rains, say, in northern Medina County, well, that water has to make its way kind of to the south and down into the main part of the artesian zone. Then it will slowly travel to the east, up towards the springs. So imagine this vast system where the water's always moving, it's never stagnant. And it may take a year, it may take 100 years, it depends on what flow path the water picks, because there's probably some areas where that water moves really rapidly, and then there are certainly areas where it probably doesn't. So it's really something to think about. If I'm a drop of water and I fall on a recharge zone where we're at right now, I might go out the springs in a year, or I might not go out the springs for 100 years. And that's part of the complexity of the system, but it's really something to think about. Big system, a lot of flow paths, has really good water in it. It yields a lot of water. A lot of people depend on it. A lot of species depend on it. So the importance of the system, I guess, can't be understated.
So when I try to visualize it in my head, what I'm hearing is that it's a series of pathways for water to follow, initially in the contributing zone, that is mostly surface flow or just under subsurface flow, but it all stays pretty close to the top. And then in the, the contributing zone, the infiltration, the recharge zone, a lot of terms, that's where it actually sinks down. And that's the thinnest sliver. So it has to make it through the contributing zone to that zone, then it can get down into it. And then there we have more of a contained system, but it's a mixture of caves and fractured rock and, you know, kind of rubble and gravel. But as that water builds up, it builds up pressure, which is what makes it an artesian zone, and that's what makes it come out of the springs that we all know and love.
Comes out under pressure there, and you know, we're standing on a recharge zone now, and it's kind of, this is what I would call kind of a typical recharging stream. This is what they tend to look like. There are some surface water streams that may have water north of the recharge zone, even sometimes during drought. But by the time they cross the recharge zone, they may lose most, if not all, of their base flow into the aquifer as it crosses the recharge zone, which is really something interesting to think about. And, you know, Cibolo Creek that we're standing in, it recharges a lot of water into the system in wet years, but it's usually just like it is now. It's pretty much dry.
One thing that I think about a lot is how deeply incised some of our waterways are, and how they seem to be getting more deeply incised due to increased severity of runoff and how much water is hitting those quickly. But what I'm hearing here, and from what we've said before, like some of this rock has been exposed for 300 million years. So it's starting to help to shape my thinking a little bit around, well, the goal isn't necessarily to lift all of these streams back up, but what do you think about waterways that are more connected to floodplains instead of incised? Is that something that EAA considers or works with?
So we've certainly, because of the work at the Field Research Park, I guess I would phrase it as we've started to take a much more focused look at things like riparian zones and their health and their importance, because if they're healthy, then we keep our runoff cleaner. And then, you know, as we've talked about, this stream had a few feet of water in it a couple of days ago, and typically that water will stay here for a couple of days and then it infiltrates. That's water that's not flowing. There's actually some obstructions downstream of where we're standing that causes the water to pool up and stand right here. But if you think about how big this stream bed is where we're at, that's a lot of water, right? And to infiltrate that much water that quickly is a pretty big deal. But we also have reasonably healthy riparian zones around us, so that water's in pretty good shape when it comes off the land here. We've had occasions where this stream actually flooded from big rainfall events upstream, which was pretty interesting to see. There was a couple of years ago, there was a big rain up around Bernie, several inches of rain, and we had a bit of a wall of water come down, and the stream here filled up to 10 or 12 feet deep. So that was really impressive because we didn't get rain here.
Right, that's one of those flash flood alley
Yeah.
moments where you realize, you know, pre-weather prediction and all these information ways, you could have been camping out down by
Yeah.
the creek and then suddenly had a 10-foot wall of water come
Right.
pouring through.
Yeah, and maybe that's also a good way for people to kind of visualize the contributing zone. So Bernie is part of the contributing zone. Well, it contributed to recharge here, even though it didn't rain here. So what happens up there also has an impact, if you will, downstream in the recharge zone of the Edwards Aquifer. You know, maybe it's worth talking a little bit about, well, who is the EAA? What is the Edwards Aquifer Authority, and what do we do, and why do we exist? So our goal and our job, in a nutshell, is to manage, enhance, and protect the Edwards Aquifer. And how do we do that? Well, we do that through the use of a permit system that was developed over the last many years. It took several years of the agency's life to develop the permitting system, to fight the legal battles associated with that, and to effectively be able to manage withdrawals from the aquifer to the benefit of all the users, whether that be a permit holder or to flow at the springs. So I mentioned a permitting system, and what does that really mean? Well, it means if you use water from the Edwards Aquifer as a industrial or municipal or agricultural user, then you have to have a permit associated with that groundwater use. In essence, we only have about 1,200, actually the number might be a little bit higher now, but let's say 1,200 permits, but there are around 2 million people that benefit from those 1,200 groundwater withdrawal permits. Just to put that in a little bit more perspective, the maximum amount of water that's permitted on an annual basis to be withdrawn from the aquifer through wells is 572,000 acre-feet. And again, I hate to use that term acre-foot, but think of a football field 1 foot deep in water. That's 1 acre-foot of water. Multiply that by 572,000, and that's the allowable amount of withdrawals from the aquifer if we don't have a year where we have to reduce how much can be withdrawn because of a drought situation. So think of it another way, 186 billion gallons of water. It's a lot of water. One of the ways we effectively manage those permits and we manage withdrawals from the system in order to maintain higher aquifer levels year-round, regardless of drought conditions, is through something we call critical period management. And those are a series of cutbacks based on the level of the aquifer in the San Antonio pool at J17. There are other factors, but to keep it simple, we'll just talk about J17. When the water level at J17 in Bexar counties at or above 660, then there's no cutback on your permit. If it goes below 660, we call that stage 1. You have an associated 20% cutback on your permit for the period of time that the aquifer is below 660 feet. And this goes all the way through stage 5. So in the most severe circumstance, we would be in stage 5. Right now, the San Antonio pool is on its way out, hopefully, of stage 4. We've been in stage 4 for quite some time. The Uvalde pool, which is just Uvalde County, has been in stage 5 for an extended period because the extremely severe drought that we have here in the San Antonio area has actually been even worse in the Uvalde County area. So as you go west, think of it this way, this current drought gets even worse. In this video, we've talked a lot about the Edwards Aquifer and the Edwards Aquifer Authority. One of the questions that we get a lot, especially lately, is, well, how bad is the drought? I mean, it's just a drought, right? Things are green, it's okay. Well, let's look at that a little more detailed. And let's analyze really quickly, without being boring and talking about a bunch of math, let's just look at these dots here and talk about every drought we have recorded over the last 90 years shows up on this graph. And what this graph really tells us is, if that dot plots higher up and farther to the right, then that drought is worse than the ones that don't. So most of the people that see this video probably remember 2012 to 2015, things were bad, they were really dry. How does that compare to the drought that we're in now? This is the current drought, and the intensity of the current drought is greater than the intensity of the last drought that we were in. We've not yet reached the level of duration of what we call the drought of record, the drought that lasted for 10 years or 8 years in the 1950s. We're about halfway there, more or less. We saw some really good, healthy rains this week. We had about 6 inches of rain plus here at the Field Research Park. We had a fairly large coverage of that rain event. We don't know, and we can't really say with certainty whether or not that is some kind of indicator that we're going into a wetter pattern for a while. We hope that we are, but to put things in perspective, we're 70 inches plus behind on rainfall since 2020. We got a little extra rain this month. It doesn't mean that the drought is over. It means that things are slightly better. It means that if this continues for multiple events over an extended period, we might expect groundwater levels to come back up to where they should be historically at this time of year, but that just has to remain to be seen. You know, statistically, May and June tend to be pretty wet months, especially May. So we're holding out hope that better news is on the way. But in terms of what's working, if you look at how intense this drought is and the fact that it's the second longest duration drought that we have records for, the springs are still flowing and people are still able to use water from the aquifer. And in large part, that's because of a very well thought out, technically defensible groundwater management system that's implemented by the Edwards Aquifer Authority that works to maintain a little bit higher aquifer levels and a little bit higher spring flows than otherwise would be the case if we didn't have those management measures.
What would it take for the Edwards Aquifer to, at least temporarily, get so low that the people who rely on it would no longer be able to do so? And what would be the results of that? And how are you guys helping to prevent that from happening?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So we know historically in the drought of record, which occurred in the 1950s, that J17 got down to about 612.5. That's elevation of the groundwater above mean sea level. And at that point, Comal Springs didn't flow. There was still water ponded up at the springs, but it wasn't flowing. So that's the lowest we've ever seen it. Our written record doesn't go back beyond about 1930. So it's hard to know the answer to that in a sense, but we have a regulatory system that curtails available use, if you will. It's called critical period management. So as the aquifer gets lower, you're actually allowed to use less of your permit. So everyone who relies on the aquifer that's an industrial, municipal, or agricultural user has a groundwater permit. So we regulate that, and we've done a lot of work to model that in a way that we can maximize the benefit to the permit holders while we still maintain spring flow. I think it's fair to say in a situation where if things got so bad and it didn't rain for a period of years, we can regulate and we can manage and we can do all these great things, but if it didn't rain for long enough, then it's conceivable that there's not a way to manage through that. And because of that very, very slight possibility, We invested some years ago in building a refugia for all the endangered species. Should that ever happen, that worst case scenario, our habitat conservation plan and our incidental take permit are built around making sure those species are protected. And that would allow those permit holders to continue to use water at what we would call stage 5 restriction, but we would also be protective of the species. And we hope we never see that day, but I guess that's the answer to the worst case scenario question. I told somebody a year or so ago that was out here asking kind of similar questions. I said, well, in essence, we have some of the best drought data you could ever hope to have. Now we would like to have some wet data.
Right.
Look at this from an observational perspective, right? And say, well, is the grass healthier or greener, or the trees happier? I think we could point to a number of areas out here where observationally, these techniques have been effective, but that's just not good enough for what we're trying to accomplish.
You know, evaporation is taking over. Gravity can no longer pull water down through the pores and the matrix of the soil, and also the plant root suction is taking over and taking up the soil. So we have this tiny window in which you can actually get water to move vertically through the soil.
That one data set, at least, tends to agree with the hypothesis that, oh, we did this structure and we created an infiltration point and we've tried to enhance the soil with more roots in the ground. Well, the data seem to support the hypothesis that that indeed does offer more opportunity for infiltrating water into the subsurface.
EAA staff 20 years from now, maybe 50 years from now, will still be continuing the research that we're starting here today. Yeah, so the Field Research Park is a 151-acre property that in 2019 was purchased by the City of San Antonio through their Edwards Aquifer Protection Program. And the City of San Antonio then gifted us this property to be the owners, in which now they hold the conservation easement on it. And that conservation easement also allows us to do the research we're doing here. And that's really valuable to the Edwards Aquifer Authority because it allows us to do research out here kind of uninterrupted. We're able to be here, enter the property, you know, on our own terms and do our research on our own terms. We don't necessarily have to ask permission to come on the property. And, you know, EAA staff 20 years from now, maybe 50 years from now, will still be continuing the research that we're starting here today.
So right behind us we have a Berms swale system. It's arguably a form of terracing. But essentially what we've done, or what the Edwards Aquifer Authority has done, is created an area in the landscape where water is actually going to be captured and is going to sit level in the landscape, which is going to increase the amount of time that it has to infiltrate into the ground. The way that has been done is essentially by creating a speed bump. You've created an earthen mound that's stopping the water, and this mound is going across the contour, which means it's all at the same elevation. So we're not trying to drain the water one way or another, we're trying to keep it in place. And then on top of that, now you have manufactured a situation where there's more topsoil in this berm. It's not going to erode as easily as other places on the landscape. So you can use this as a place to place native seeds and also to plant trees. And the roots of those trees are also going to further improve the infiltration and utilize this passive irrigation system that we have right here. So it's improving infiltration on the property, slowing down erosion, and it's also just a way to improve the health of a tree planting on the property.
Yeah, so this location was an ideal spot for a Berms swale because one of the things when we first received this property we did was came out and did a geoprobe test, which basically told us how deep our soil profile was and how deep it was to the bedrock. And we found that we had a decent soil profile here, deep enough to have earth to work with to make a Berms swale. So if the site was too rocky or if the soils are too thin, we wouldn't be able to construct that Berms swale. There's also some other conditions here that made it ideal, that we have a hill slope on the up gradient here that it's going to shed water, that does have a lot of limestone in it and thin soils that can be prone in certain conditions to have some higher runoff. So we're going to be able to capture that runoff in this berm and swell and allow it to infiltrate. So we have our berm down there is completely planted with native species, and it had no irrigation. Where this is a setup where it was planted with some fruit trees, native fruit trees, and just productive fruit trees that a homeowner might want to have on their property, and maybe a landowner, if they build a berm and swell, they would probably like to have some fruit trees on their property. So that was kind of part of our consideration, is how would this be attractive to a landowner.
So much of our instrumentation is really focused on measuring changes in subsurface moisture, right? And we also measure water coming out of the system. We measure the evapotranspiration component using an eddy covariant system. But when it doesn't rain, you don't really have a lot to measure, so it's hard to determine in a quantitative sense, well, how effective are these structures? So we've really been hampered by that. We started this process in 2020. In fact, we built this berm and swale system in October of 2020, then populated it with the trees in early 21. 21 was a reasonably wet year compared to the other years around it, but we did not have this instrumentation in place at that point. We were so early in the process. So it seems to correlate well, right? We began to figure out with our research team, well, what instruments do we need? How are we going to go about measuring all of this? And then it stopped raining for the next 4 years. I think this week has probably been some of the best rainfall that we've had, and we hope that we'll be able to get some good data from that event. But it has been exceedingly difficult because you can't measure what you don't have. But if you look at this another way, so we're trying to do this in a very scientific and very rigorous methodology where we can quantify the benefits. But if you look at this from an observational perspective, right, and say, well, is the grass healthier or greener, or the trees happier? I think we could point to a number of areas out here where observationally, these techniques have been effective, but that's just not good enough for what we're trying to accomplish.
So happy you guys are studying this rigorously.
Now, we hope that it pays off well for us. The problem is that we need a couple of years of good rainfall, right? A couple of wet years, as we say, so we can get that data. I told somebody a year or so ago that was out here asking kind of similar questions. I said, well, in essence, we have some of the best drought data you could ever hope to have. But now we would like to have some wet data.
Right.
Speaking of, I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more to like how to define drought and different ways people might be thinking about drought.
I think that's a great question, because in so many ways, depending on what you do, you may perceive drought slightly differently than someone else. So we're in the groundwater business, or the groundwater world, and we tend to look at drought from the perspective of, well, how is it impacting our groundwater levels in the Edwards Aquifer? But most of the drought information you see on the news and elsewhere is really focused more on things like soil moisture content and surface streams and such, and that's fine, because that's really important too. But we've tried to come up with a way to better define how intense is a drought in the Edwards Aquifer. And the data set that we've built around that really applies only to the Edwards Aquifer, because that's the data we use to develop it. All originates with water levels in the Edwards, as well as it takes into account things like temperatures, average temperatures, rainfall. So if we look at that data, and we could perhaps take a look at a slide that we have later that really outlines this, but the current drought that we're in, as far as the intensity of the drought, it is actually more intense than any of the droughts that we've seen in the record, and the record goes back about 90 years. So the drought of record, the 1950s drought, the duration was about 10 years, and the intensity was very high. Our current drought has a duration of roughly 5 years, but with a greater intensity than what we see in the drought of record. So what does that mean in the long term? I don't think that we could answer that question right now, because it depends wholly on what happens next. Are we going into a wet period? Is this drought potentially going to break over the next several months? We don't know. We had some good rain, but if you look at weather patterns from 2020, during the time span from 2020 to present, we're still about 70 inches of rain behind what the average would be for that period. So that's almost 2 years, or right at 2 years worth of rain that we're missing over a 5-year period. So that has a big impact on groundwater. You may still have some healthy vegetation around, so it may not look like we're in a drought, but in terms of groundwater levels, we're still in a pretty significant drought.
Yeah. And I would say, like, even if we go into a wetter year, it's even more important, I would argue, to have good management practices so that we have as much effective rainfall as possible to kind of catch up.
I would agree, and I think from our perspective as a groundwater management agency, you know, water quantity is important, but so is quality. So a lot of what we do here really has a very positive impact on reducing sediment transport into our surface streams, and that's important for a lot of reasons, especially in a karst system like this where you don't get a lot of filtration of your recharge. So we want that water going into the recharging streams to be as clean as possible when it gets there. So we're also looking at that as part of our methodology here to better quantify the effectiveness of different types of land management or nature-based solutions. There's a lot of terminology out there, and I think you could make an argument for using different ones for different things, but I guess in my view it's, can we do a better job at adding resilience to the landscape so that it takes better care of itself, so that we have cleaner water and perhaps more abundant water, or at least more sustainable approaches to how we do that.
So what we have here is a pressure transducer. Basically what that is it measures water pressure, and that water pressure that's measured inside of this swell can then be turned into a water level. We also know through LiDAR surveys what the dimensions of this swell and what the volume of the swell is. And so paired with that water level data, we should be able to calculate how much water actually infiltrated during an event.
Do you guys have any idea of how much rainfall it takes to start filling this, like 2 inches, 3 inches? I know that's a moving target, but.
That's a good question. It depends on a lot of things, usually what your antecedent soil moisture levels are. So having our soils pretty saturated right now, if we had an inch of rain, we would probably end up with some water collecting in here, where on another day, if the soils are really dry, an inch of rain, you probably wouldn't find any standing water in the swell. Right. Yeah, so this pressure transducer is connected to the box on the tall T-post over there with the solar panel. That's the data logger, where then that data is on telemetry, is sent back through cellular signal where we can retrieve it on our desktops at the office and see the data pretty much in real time. This pressure transducer is logging about every 15 minutes. And then also you see here on these shorter T-posts with the series of white boxes, these are our soil sensor arrays, which are also radio transmitting to the data logger where we can see the data real time as well. So we can talk a little bit more about what these soil sensors are. Okay, so as we mentioned, this is our soil sensor array that's taking continuous soil measurements. What we have here at 2 different depths, at 10 centimeters deep and 30 centimeters deep, we have probes that are measuring soil water content, which is also known as soil moisture, soil water potential, soil temperature, and electrical conductivity. Yeah, so one of the interesting parameters in this soil sensor array is the soil water potential. And why that is interesting is basically what it's measuring is a saturation level of the soil. And really it's measured in kilopascals, which is kind of a measure of pressure or suction, which then tells us like how easily can water move down to deeper parts of the soil. So 0 would be completely saturated, and then there's kind of a reference point as negative 1,500 kilopascals would be the permanent wilting point of plants. They say really it's measured against the permanent wilting point of a sunflower. But that just gives you an idea of this range that we can go through, because we definitely get down to those levels of, negative 1,000, negative 1,500 here at the Field Research Park. And we're sitting at 0 pretty much right now, or between 0 and negative 1. And that's important because there's a very small window from 0 to negative 33 that you can actually move water down deeper through the soil. So once it gets beyond that negative 33, that's when evaporation is taking over. Gravity can no longer pull water down through the pores and the matrix of the soil, and also the plant root suction is taking over and taking up the soil. So we have this tiny window in which you can actually get water to move vertically through the soil. And so we think that could be an interesting component of the swales, because we do see that the swales maintain soil water content for a longer period of time and higher water potential for a longer period of time. So basically they are it's maintaining the conditions to move water vertically for a longer period than the surrounding area.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So in regenerative agriculture, a lot of people talk about for every 1% of organic matter that you add to the soil, you can hold another 20,000 gallons of water per acre, I think is the number that a lot of people use. And so in relation to that, what you were just talking about, is there a correlation in what you're measuring there and organic matter? Like as soil improves, do you expect to see the numbers that you were just talking about changing?
I think we could possibly expect that. What's interesting about the swale is actually because we have removed topsoil here and exposed subsoil, that our soil samples show that the soil organic matter in the swale is actually lower. So a lot of that infiltration and that longer wetting period that we have here is, I think it's really just due to kind of the physics of actually you just put so much water in this location that it makes it hold water for longer. But generally speaking, yeah, if you're increasing your soil organic matter, you should be increasing your water holding capacity and the health of all the vegetation surrounding it.
So that's the soil itself, but that doesn't necessarily always correlate to water making it down to the aquifer. There's connection, but it's more technical and more complicated than that, right?
It gets a lot more complicated than that. Just because you've infiltrated water doesn't mean that it's recharged. Between us and the water table in the aquifer right now, there's about 150 feet. So there's a lot of different processes that are happening there before water can actually make it that far.
A lot of times you'll have a layer of limestone that might be fractured, and you might get some vertical infiltration. Then you may hit a really marly clay-like layer that diverts some of that water laterally, so you get some lateral movement. I think of it this way: water is like a good gardener or a good geologist. You always look for the path of least resistance to travel by, right? So save your steps. But that, you see that so often in the contributing zone on a lot of properties where you have a lot of seep springs. And it's not that that can't occur in the Edwards, but a lot of the Edwards rock tends to be more transmissive a lot of times. So you may lose more water into the subsurface more rapidly. And I mean, never say always or never, because there's certainly exceptions, but we have a video clip of what I think of often as recharge, where you have these very small whirlpools the size of a quarter going through a small solution feature in the rock body. And that, in essence, is recharge, and that's a very rapid recharge. But here on the soil surface, our recharge rates would be likely much slower because you've got to go through the soil and then this 150 feet of unsaturated zone that has different properties that may impede or slow down your infiltration. But then I think you have other areas on the property where even over the land surface, you may have a lot of fractured rock in some area where you have rapid infiltration. And maybe some of that makes it directly to recharge. I would love to be able to quantify that too over time. So it's such a complex system that it's hard to speak in generalities about, or it's hard to speak in specifics about, well, it's always going to do this or that, because it may do this in one area and something else in another area. So it's just a difficult number of variables to assimilate into the equation.
Yeah, I think the soundbite that I was reacting to is I remember hearing in this conversation that it took on average like 800 years for water to make it to the water table from upland areas. And they were, I think, trying to distinguish that like you could be recharging groundwater that is closer to the surface from like the water table that we might associate with like the ocean level. I think that's what they were describing. But
I think every aquifer is a little bit different, and you can do different types of dating for your water. And you may find water that has, for example, no modern carbon, so it's really old water. And then you may take a sample 10 miles away that has really young water. And you can think of like Comal and San Marcos Springs as this big composite sample of everything that moves through this system. And you can start trying to unravel, well, how long does it take water to move from one county to the next to the springs? And because of the mixing component, it's really hard to to put detail to that, but there are areas in the Edwards where water moves very, very rapidly. And then I think there's areas where it probably doesn't. But then there are other aquifer systems where water might move 2 or 3 centimeters a day in the subsurface versus several feet or maybe hundreds of feet a day. So again, you know, I wish I had these really succinct answers, but it just depends on where you're looking and how you're looking. If I recall correctly, the volume on this is almost 8,000 gallons when it's, quote, full.
Do you have a figure?
See the strand line there of how full it was.
Do you have a figure for how many gallons are being stored per linear foot of berm?
Well, I don't. I hadn't thought about it in
Yeah,
that
we haven't
fashion.
done that calculation.
Okay.
I think we somehow derived that it was 18 gallons per linear foot. It might be from y'all's total and how long this berm is, but that's the number that I've had and been using.
About 18 gallons per linear foot.
Glad we concur. That's what I've told all of our clients.
So the data set we looked at, that ERT or electrical resistivity tomography, is run off, you can barely see the stakes in the ground over there. So we have that one data set that I shared that's been fully analyzed and represents a significant rainfall event. We've only had that tool for about a year.
Okay.
So that's one of the limitations, is we just haven't had any big rainfall events. This most recent event, hopefully we'll be able to grab a data set from that.
Okay.
But over time, you know, with more rain, we should be able to build and analyze that data. To go with that, we have a series of boreholes across this berm and swale system, so above, within, and below. That's where we run our nuclear magnetic resonance tool, which gives us a lot of that detailed data. We combine that with the ERT data, combine it with our soil profiling data, combine it with our rainfall data and ET data. Now we start to build that picture of, okay, how's this behave? How effective is it? Can we quantify this over time?
Yeah. So what did that data show? Like, are there any surprises, anything that you weren't expecting that came up? Or
That's a really interesting question. I think it's one of the few things in my career where we form a hypothesis and we think it's going to work this way and rarely ever does it. That one data set, at least, tends to agree with the hypothesis that, oh, we did this structure and we created an infiltration point and we've tried to enhance the soil with more roots in the ground. Well, the data seems to support the hypothesis that that indeed does offer more opportunity for infiltrating water into the subsurface. Whether or not that becomes recharge, I can't tell you yet.
okay. Yeah.
So these little stakes in the ground are actually just electrodes for our electrical resistivity tomography work. And this line extends for quite a ways, and it gives us a nice two-dimensional slice of what's going on in the subsurface with regard to changes in moisture. We have a team that comes out within a few days of a big rainfall event and tries to collect data from these. It takes pretty much all day just to run through that process, so it's pretty labor intensive, but I think the data can be very informative in terms of helping us to better understand how effective these structures might be at enhancing soil moisture and potentially somewhere down the road better understanding how overland or diffuse recharge works. And then right behind you we have some boreholes that are about 30 feet deep, and those boreholes go from above all the way to below this berm and swale system, and we use these to run our nuclear magnetic resonance tool in. And that tool is similar in some ways to the ERT in that it tells us a whole lot about moisture content, but it doesn't give us this long two-dimensional slice. It gives us information for a small radius around this borehole, but that information is actually very precise in comparison to the ERT. So we can use those two data sets together, combined with a lot of the other data that we have out here, and over time start to build a better picture of how things happen in the subsurface where we can't see. You know, we walked around earlier and we looked at a berm and swale system, and how do you tell whether or not that works, if it contributes water, if it makes things better, makes them worse? While this isn't a definitive outcome, this is a data set that's been analyzed, and this represents the change in moisture of that berm and swale system after about 10 inches of rainfall. And this 10 inches was scattered over the course of a month. It wasn't all at once. But the darker the blue in this representation, the higher the change or percent change in moisture content in the soil associated with the area around that berm and swale. And perhaps what's really interesting is where the swale is, we obviously, based on this one analyzed event, introduced more moisture into the subsurface than we did elsewhere. But you can also tell from this, we already had healthy soil, healthy landscape. We put a lot of water in the ground because the soil was already healthy, it has good vegetation. We just forced a little bit more in because we gave that water a place to infiltrate. And over time, this information combined with a number of other instruments that we have here at the FRP will be used to better delineate and quantify the effectiveness of different land management features so that maybe we can optimize these practices in terms of improved diffuse recharge across the region.
I had one other comment about the organic matter, and this is just like maybe in the realm of hypothetical, but if you're improving your organic matter content in the soil, then that tends to correspond with more ability to hold nutrients. And if you're holding more nutrients, you can support more biodiversity. If you have more biodiversity, you have more plant coverage that is then evapotranspirating moisture back into the atmosphere to then become rainfall and continue in this cycle for a longer period of time. So maybe that's one way in which organic matter might be improving moisture conditions, even if it's in certain situations disconnected from infiltration into the aquifer.
Well, I think you explained it pretty well. I don't know if I had much to add to that.
I have a question too. I don't know if y'all have studied stormwater mitigation from the berm as another feature. You know, if like we get a big deluge, in some cases that's good for us to get a lot of water, but as we all know, flooding can be very dangerous and also just take all our topsoil away.
So we focused probably more on the stormwater component at one of our other sites on the other half of the property. We have a project we call the SCAR project, and we have some instrumentation there that actually gives us the ability to measure changes in sediment load between the top end or the up gradient end of the treatment train and the bottom end of that treatment train. Hopefully, we'll continue to get enough rain that we can get data from that as well. So those instruments have only been in place for a few months, so we're also data limited there, but hopefully we'll get some opportunities to measure that. And I don't know, Thomas may have some additional thoughts on that, but that project's been really interesting.
Yeah, well, I guess my thought is anecdotally, you know, just being out here during rain events and observing the runoff, is that runoff coming off of these natural landscapes like this that are undisturbed, you have native vegetation, are kind of a management practice in themselves that lend to really high water quality. You see pretty clean runoff coming out of areas like this hillside that we're looking at here. So I don't think this berm and swale is capturing really impaired waters. It's capturing pretty clean water. If you saw this a year and a half ago, it would have just looked like, you know, just rock here. And now we have a layer of sediment, then vegetation grew on top of it, and then another layer of sediment that's been dropped by the treatments.
I mean, look at this. This is deep.
2 people and a chainsaw, you can build this structure in 15 minutes probably if you have enough juniper around you.
I think for a lot of landowners in Texas that you don't have control over what the people upstream of you do, but that water does flow onto your land and then it becomes your responsibility. So I'm really excited for people to learn about how to make that liability an asset, because if they can get it into their soil, then they can see improvements in their vegetation and soil health. And a lot of these solutions that we're going to talk about are pretty straightforward, and I think with your help explaining them and with some of the research you're doing, landowners can learn to do this with more confidence.
This area here is what we call the SCAR project, which stands for Sustainable Channel and Restoration. Essentially, the area behind me when we received this property in 2019 had a pretty intact drainage channel, ephemeral channel over here, and we had some changes in the landscape higher in the watershed off of our property that added some impervious cover and ended up increasing the runoff rates that are coming onto our property and creating some erosion. So we saw this as an opportunity to test the nature-based solutions or natural infrastructure type practices that we're working with to see if that can actually mitigate or reverse the impacts of that type of drainage that's coming onto our property. So as we go through here, we'll take a look and see how we're doing that. So here we are, we're starting at the highest point in our treatment area in the drainage. This fence line here is right to my right, which is as far as we can go on our property line. And so as we're entering the property, as I said, we have some impervious cover upstream of us. We have some increased sediment loads coming down, definitely higher flows of water than historically this channel had seen. And so what we are doing is placing a series of rock and brush treatments in the channel here with the goal of seeing if we can lower the total dissolved solids that are moving in that water. And the way that we are looking to measure that is with this white box that is right over here. Within that box is an automatic water quality sampler. What that does is when the water level gets high enough here, it's going to automatically fill some sample bottles inside of that sampler that then can be taken to be analyzed for total dissolved solids. And this is a bubbler. So it's pushing out a little bubble every few seconds. And as that bubble is pushed out, the instrumentation inside of the box is able to detect pressure change. So you can imagine it's a little harder to push out that bubble when it has water on top of it. So that's how it knows when it needs to start pumping water. Yeah, so this structure here is one of our first structures. These are kind of experimental the first time we're working with these. This started out as something that we called a brush weir, our first large event. Last year in 2025 kind of blew it out, and then we came and did some adaptive management to it. So a lot of times these practices aren't just something you go out and do once. You're going to have to come back and maybe do some maintenance on them or see how it's responding to basically the conditions of your property or the intensity of the storm event that maybe it came through. So we came back and kind of adjusted into what we call a brush mat now. So it was constructed completely of juniper that was on the property. It's interwoven with existing junipers that were there to help hold it in place, otherwise they would wash away. But when we're looking at the base of the stream here, as you look upstream, you don't see any sediments really accumulating on these rocks because the velocity of the water is taking that sediment with it. When we look at the structure here, you immediately start to see very thick layers of sediment that have been accumulated, and as it slows that water down, it's able to drop these sediments out. So we have organic debris and then, pure soil right there that is being accumulated that we're preventing from being washed further downstream, eventually to Cibolo Creek, where a really high recharge is able to happen. Really, the initial observation really is how much sediment has dropped out. And as we move down through these treatments, as you'll see right below that area to my right, where it's very grassy, that originally looked a lot like this. And there's a large one rock dam structure that had been placed there. The very first event dropped a lot of sediment. Since then, grass has been able to actually grow on that structure, and then now with another event, more sediment has been dropped out.
When I look closely at all of this debris and sediment here, it's actually teeming with life. There's ants and roly-polies, and there's, I'm sure, fungus in here, bacteria in here. So it's not just the material, but it's the life that these conditions supports, which then also breaks it down into healthy soil. So this is how we capture the ingredients in the highlands that build soil in the highlands where we need it the most. So why did you guys, why are you putting the juniper like parallel with the stream instead of perpendicular?
Yeah, so kind of as I mentioned, actually originally we did have a structure that was built perpendicular here, and it created such a force behind it, and it holds so much litter and debris behind it that it eventually just kind of blew out. So these, when you're working with the juniper, placing the large end of the trunk on the up gradient side with the needles and the small branches down on the end, it allows more of a situation where water can flow through it more easily, but it still gives the ability to capture sediments and organic matter. So it's not so much of a damming as it is of a slowing. I think having this large structure up here in front, and initially when we did have that, what we called the brush weir, it probably saved a lot of our downstream structures because it kind of took that initial brunt. So as I said, we decided that the best way to do this, because you can kind of still see the remnants of that original structure that had been pushed down there. So then we came back and laid our branches in more of the brush mat formation. But yeah, I think it's all situational. I can't just say that always a brush weir is going to have some benefit over the brush mat. It really depends on the situation you're in and how to apply it. You can't just kind of give this overarching prescription with a certain practice.
Sure, but you could build something like this either way in 30 minutes to an hour with a chainsaw if there's cedar nearby or other trees that you're willing to cut and put into it.
Yeah, 2 people and a chainsaw, you can build this structure in 15 minutes probably if you have enough juniper around you. What you're going to see here, the high interval and density of the structures that we've installed are really due to the specific situation we have here, where we know we have higher, more intense flows than originally occurred here. So we've installed them perhaps even more densely than they would on perhaps another property that has more of a natural runoff situation happening.
I mean, just my initial reaction is like, walking on this spongy soil surface, and I can already just, having been involved with this work, imagine this is just pure rock before.
Yeah, and this soil here is the result of the treatments that we have upstream. I think it's a combination between that brush mat and what this was originally was a very large one rock dam, kind of a combination of a one rock dam and a rock rundown that were placed here. And if you saw this a year and a half ago, it would have just looked like, just rock here. And now we have a layer of sediment, then vegetation grew on top of it, and then another layer of sediment that's been dropped by the treatments.
I mean, look at this. This is deep.
Which this is the ultimate goal,
is
to have vegetation growing, to get those living roots in the ground.
Mm-hmm. So it seems to me like, your brush mat, which was originally a brush weir, so like more of like a horizontal, perpendicular to water flow, but the brush mat is also still slowing down water, capturing sediment. That sediment's depositing here before it hits another obstacle that you've put up to slow down water, and that's also going to probably passively irrigate the vegetation that's growing in the soil uphill.
Yeah, correct.
Mm-hmm. And so that's the brush weir that you put in, and that T-post, was that originally a part of the design, or did you have to add that?
So this is just one of those things where it's very site specific. It may not end up probably wouldn't end up like this at any other location. But there was a large boulder in the middle of the stream here, and a boulder much larger than we were willing to move. And a boulder like that in a stream can actually, even though it was a natural feature, can be what we would call a nick point. It could be a point where water's hitting it and it starts to actually cause erosion around it. So instead of removing that boulder, we used it in combinations with these existing junipers. We put a T-post in front of the boulder to kind of anchor our T-post, and then we wove juniper branches through the existing junipers and the T-post that are being held up by that boulder to create this brush weir.
Very cool. And you were saying earlier that now, over time, you've started to armor this side of the brush weir, which is kind of like a spillway that you've created.
Yeah, so when we constructed the brush weir, we anticipated some flow would go around the edge, so it's kind of also been combined with a one rock dam. And we can talk a bit more. We'll find a more practical example of one rock dam and get into the details of how to construct that and why.
Okay, very cool.
So we're standing here at one of the structures that are called a one rock dam. And just to start, the reason you would construct a one rock dam it is an in-stream channel, but you would use it in a small or ephemeral stream. So earlier when we were down in Cibolo Creek, we wouldn't want to try to place these structures down there. The flow is just too strong and it would wash these out. And we're not concerned about trying to control any water or sediments in such a large drainage or such a large stream. Yeah, as I was saying, one rock dams are in-channel structure, and the end goal of what they're designed to do is end up raising your stream bed. And that is important. So we aren't necessarily working with a really incised, eroded stream bed here. We're focusing more on slowing down water, dropping out sediments for water quality. But it's also very important in streams, especially that are incised, that we reconnect the floodplains of those streams. Because as a stream incises more and more, the moisture and the water associated with that stream gets separated from the surface vegetation and can cause out a drying of the surface vegetation around it. And a one rock dam, what it can do is it can accumulate sediment behind it and on top of it, establishes vegetation, and then you can come in and build another one rock dam right on top of that. And over time, through this slow progression, you can get your stream beds back up to the level that they need to do, eventually reconnecting that floodplain, allowing those sediments to get onto the floodplain and supply fertility and moisture and water to the land surrounding it.
Can you elaborate on what you mean by incise for anyone who doesn't know what that term is?
Yeah, so an incised stream would be a stream that is down cutting. It's basically eroding deeper and deeper. You may have seen this before in streams that have these steep vertical banks. That's what would be an incised stream. And in our region, I feel like you see that a lot more commonly in the contributing zone because the soils and the bedrock there are more conducive to that situation, where here in the Edwards, we often have very competent hard Edwards limestone near the surface with thin soil. So that water can't really incise the streams because it just gets to the point of having bedrock underneath it. But if that bedrock isn't there, the stream could just continue to go deeper and deeper and deeper.
And I know these structures are relatively new, but can you share any reflections or any changes that you've noticed since they've been here?
Yeah, I'm definitely noticing that we're getting a little more species diversity, especially within the rocks. So if we take a closer look, we can actually see some of the function that is happening here. As you look down in between these rocks, you start to see sediment being captured within the rocks. We're seeing a little more diversity, and that's especially because not only do they capture sediment, but they kind of provide a haven for vegetation, because whether it's livestock or wildlife, they don't really like to walk on this, and it makes it more difficult for them to browse or graze on the vegetation here. So it's kind of a haven for species diversity and also capturing those sediments. So yeah, we are already definitely seeing both of those things happen here.
That's awesome. And did y'all put any native seed down, or it just emerged?
Well, we did do some native seeding. I think most of what's emerging here is coming up from the seed bank that was already here. And yeah, I think we can talk a little bit about construction is important and how some of these general rules that apply to the one rock dam and kind of apply to a lot of the rock structures as well. As we get closer, we'll see that really when we built the one rock dam first, it has a footer row in the front of larger rocks. And that was actually a small trench that was dug where those footer rocks are placed in there to hold this in place, to hold all of this structure behind it. And then as rocks are placed, rocks are never placed on top of another rock. So this isn't necessarily a check dam where you're stacking rocks on top of rocks, but because, as I said, our purpose is that we want to establish the vegetation. So if we have rocks on top of the rocks, you're shading any opportunity for that vegetation to take hold. So all these cracks and crevices are going to allow sediment to fill in and then vegetation to grow on top of it. And we also want our one rock dam to be at least 5 rocks deep. So having 5 general rows of rocks here. And also as we're doing construction, because our goal is to have vegetation, we don't place rocks on top of existing vegetation. Say, for instance, you may see some empty spots where there's not as much rock like this. It's because we had some good existing vegetation here. It's already doing a job better than a rock can do. So again, that lends to this, I just want to emphasize that our goal is to have healthy vegetation. It's not just about the rocks.
Yeah, that's a great point. Is there a certain basis for the width? You said 5 rocks, but rocks are varying sizes. How do you think about what's the appropriate size of structure that you need in an area?
So that is definitely a rule that is prescribed from kind of the originator of these practices, Bill Zedike. He's a gentleman out of New Mexico. He worked for the Forest Service for a very long time, and he pioneered these structures and popularized, okay, I didn't say that word right, let's cut that out. Anyway, yeah, he pioneered these structures, and we have actually had a lot of help from someone that learned directly from Bill. Her name is Dr. Molly Walton, and she has been great assistance to us in guiding us and teaching us about how to build these structures. So that 5 rocks deep comes from him, so I'll trust that prescription on how they came to that, but the size and the length of it is going to be what's really specific to your situation. And even, I guess how deep they are can be specific too, because as I mentioned, the structure that we first looked at with all the sediment on it, that's a one rock dam too, but it's probably 40 rocks deep. But that was an area where we knew we were going to have a lot of high flow back there in a tighter part of the channel, and we really wanted to armor it.
That's one of the beautiful things about these structures too, is they're modular, and as you're observing, you can easily, modify them.
And actually this particular structure originally came about as far as where I'm sitting, and then about a year later, after we had a few flow events, we realized it needed to be wider, and we extended it to where you see it now.
It's not every day that I get to learn a new term for a land management practice, but you've taught me something, a media luna. Could you tell me more about what that means?
It's called a media luna, and that just means half moon in Spanish. As looking at it, you can probably see why. It just has this crescent shape here. But really what the media luna does is it's a sheet flow spreader. So as we were looking at the One Rock Dam, that was an in-channel practice. The media luna is more intended for kind of an overland flow situation, but where you might have some concentrated flow. So not a high stream flow, but you might have concentrated flow that's coming in and then giving you some problems downhill, maybe creating some erosion. So upgrading of that erosional problem, you could place this media luna, which is surveyed in. Each tip of the media luna is at the same elevation. The degree of this arc in the media luna is really up to the designer. That's kind of up to you about how you want the water to be able to spread behind it. But essentially, as water intercepts, this media luna intercepts the water, it's going to spread it out behind it and then fan it, and diverting all of that velocity and energy over a wider part of the landscape.
It's almost like sending light through a prism is what comes to mind for me. It's like taking a beam and then diffusing it and spreading it out in multiple directions. That's very cool.
And so I was going to say the principles constructing the media luna, as I mentioned, the tips are surveyed in, but it's very similar in the One Rock Dam that we have a footer row here that was trenched in. We're still going by that 5 rock deep rule. We're still following the rules of not putting rocks on top of, good solid existing vegetation, and we're also not putting rocks on top of rocks.
And I think these structures are really neat because people could feasibly do them all with on-site materials. Like I can see just uphill of us, there's enough rocks sitting on the surface. They're about the right size that you could feasibly gather those up with a wheelbarrow and just build a structure like this
You're absolutely right.
a few hours.
And this, you can see the difference that the gray look of the rock here means that this was rock collected on site. So it has this little bit of a patina on it because this rock's been sitting out in the weather, where the whiter rocks that you see in our One Rock Dam, those are rocks that were brought in from the quarry. What we're standing on right now is a rock rundown, another erosion control structure. The situation that we had here is we really had some deeply incised rills here. Where you see a line of rocks here, another line of rocks there is just about covered with vegetation. We have some over here trailing down over to my left. So you could see we kind of had this network of erosive channels that were eroding deeper and deeper here. And the rock rundown is the treatment for that. And basically what we did is coming into those channels, still following those same rules of not stacking rocks on top of rocks, not placing over really good existing vegetation, but bringing our rock level back up to the same level as our soil surface. We don't want to be higher than the soil surface because then we're going to start creating that nick point again. It's even with the soil surface, as water's flowing over it, it's going to be able to drop these sediments in eventually one day, making these rocks disappear and just blending in with the landscape again. And so we kind of have a few different examples of rock structures within this rock rundown. So we have the very traditional rock rundown, but then we had a little bit steeper of an incision here, and that these rocks just couldn't quite get us up to that soil height. And so what this is called is a filter dam, where we have flat rocks that are book stacked, placed vertically, and so then that puts us able to give us that good contact with the soil here on this bank. But then as water flows over it, it's going to be able to drop those sediments in and eventually fill this up, and as I said, blend it in with the landscape.
That is very neat. I wonder if this technique would scale up effectively from like an engineering standpoint onto larger banks. And I'm not expecting you to answer that question, but I'm just musing about it.
Definitely a great question.
Yeah. I can tell that this landscape goes through a lot of boom and bust, dry and wet cycles, because I see weesatch trees here, which a lot of times we see higher up or in sandier soils or in drier places, a pioneer species tree. A lot of ranchers that I know absolutely hate this tree because of the thorns and because of its pioneering nature, and it can take over your fields or your pastures. One thing I wanted to ask about is from a just water recharge standpoint and aquifer relationship standpoint, are there any plants, let's say trees specifically, that you guys find to be more valuable or preferred just from a water standpoint, or is just healthy vegetation good in your book?
Yeah, I think I would generalize that by not just discriminating against any certain species or by, saying one species above another, but just having a healthy diversity of plants in the landscape, living roots in the ground, living cover on the soil is just the best condition that you can have for it.
Yeah, so whether it's mesquite, huisatch, juniper, persimmon, oak, all these trees, cedar elm, they're all helping in some way when it comes to the relationship of water and aquifers.
They all certainly have their place in their landscape and all have beneficial functions.
Yeah.
This structure that I'm standing behind here is called a brush mat. This is an in-channel structure, and it's pretty clear to see what it is. It's just a series of juniper branches that have been placed, again, with the trunks pointing upstream and the smaller branches on the downstream side so that we can allow that water to flow through. We don't want to create this completely damming situation that could then cause, maybe erosion to start to form around the sides. But we want to be able to slow that water down, drop the sediments, and catch that organic matter in place and hopefully over time establish some vegetation. But of course, since we didn't have any existing vegetation to tie into here to hold this juniper in place, it's being held in place with some stakes or some T-post. A 2-foot piece of T-post with a hole drilled in the top with smooth wire on it. The smooth wire is woven through the branches of the juniper and then it connects to another T-post on the other side to anchor it.
That's really brilliant. That's almost like another version of like PALs, like post-assisted log dams that you would see in an active stream channel for induced meandering or something like that. But I haven't seen this specific technique. I really like that. And that's very cost-effective as well.
Are we stealing that?
What? Stealing what?
That?
Oh, yeah, for sure. No, I mean, it's provides a solution to a problem, and I had never thought of that very simple and elegant solution for it. So I would definitely use that. Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you get the T-post in the ground?
Assuming we can get the T-post.
Yeah.
These ideally they would be sunk further. The thing to be cautious of, especially if you have livestock on the property, is that, or even people on the property, this is something you could trip on, injure yourself. Livestock could injure themselves on it. That's why we have these rocks around it. But ideally it would be sunk level with the ground surface, but we had bedrock here that we just couldn't go any deeper.
Yep. Yeah, I can see even for the rebar back there, you guys put the cap on it just to make sure.
Yeah, and so those
people or animals get
actually
hurt.
Where you see these pieces of rebar with the caps, these are have two functions. One, they're vegetation monitoring transects. So we're seeing over time how will the vegetation change in response to possibly higher moisture levels and more sediments being trapped here by these practices. And also we initially took, and these transects are also serving as a location where with a laser level, we incrementally moved across this stream and we're able to take elevations to create a diagram of the channel shape. So over time, as sediments accumulate in these channels, we'll also be able to measure how much sediment was accumulated and how is the channel shape changing over time.
All right, so I've noticed that a lot of land management decisions are made based on aesthetics and not necessarily based on function. So a lot of people feel like these brush structures that we can see behind us are messy. And so in order to keep their land looking tidy, they will gather this up and they'll burn it. And based on what we've just seen and all the different benefits that you've showed us of just putting this stuff on contour instead of burning it, I'm curious if you could help me convince more people that there's good reason to do this and that, maybe it's worth a little bit of mess.
Yeah, I think, as they say, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And I feel like that applies to this situation. And as you learn more and more about ecology, about soil health, about plant diversity, and you start to place some of these structures on your land and you see the difference of maybe plant diversity coming up under your brush berms, or, the grass is greener around that berm, or the grass is greener and more sediment is around this structure, or maybe you see a certain type of wildlife that starts inhabiting that, you start to gain an appreciation for it and actually see that it's giving this benefit to the landscape that gives beauty to it in its own way. It's not necessarily a manicured look, but it definitely lends to the ecological function and to kind of the wildness of the property, if you could say.
Yeah.
So we're standing in front of a brush media luna here. We've already talked about the rock media luna. It serves the same purpose as a sheet flow spreader. Again, as you might have some concentrated flow coming in here, it's going to intercept that flow and spread it out over the landscape. And as we can see here, we actually had some concentrated flow where you can actually see the grass is laid down here entering our structure. And as you look on the downhill side of our structure, their grass is all intact. It wasn't affected by any flow because it was spread out by this structure. You can kind of see just by looking at the organic matter within the structure how that spreading worked, how it spread the water and put the sediments and organic matter out across here. And it has the same construction principles as the rock media luna. The tips of the brush media luna were surveyed in at the same elevation, and again, that arc that you put into it is really up to the builder.
Are y'all trying to measure differences in how a brush media luna is going to behave versus the one that is made out of rock that's right uphill?
We don't have any ideas right now to measure that, but just generally speaking, we do have ideas just to measure brush structures and see perhaps how are they impacting things like soil moisture, soil temperature, by measuring that underneath there, how perhaps seeding works, like I was talking about, removing one of those stressors. The stressor could be grazing from wildlife or grazing from livestock. Maybe the area is too hot, and just allowing these little microclimates that created under the brush structures to see how much they can increase production of plant diversity and living roots in the ground there.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see the rock structure like pretty close to the brush structure, but obviously this brush structure is still effectively infiltrating, sediment. So there's some evidence that when you have a high flow area, having multiple structures close together, especially because they're easy to make.
We definitely have redundancy here, and I think perhaps the reason that this brush structure has performed so well is because it does have a rock media luna right above it. And we are in maybe a little bit higher flow situation than normally might be applied for media luna, but I think it just worked beautifully in this situation. And all this is very experimental for us. I think there's a lot of these structures haven't been used widely in the hill country region yet, so we're definitely learning as we go as well. All right, this structure is called a zuni bowl. It is a treatment for head cuts. If you don't know what a head cut is, it's basically a point in the landscape where you probably began with that little nick point like I was talking about, and then that erosion starts to take effect. It starts to downcut and starts to unzip up the landscape. So it just becomes this kind of perpetual problem. And it's usually due to an upstream issue from high flows coming down, hitting that nick point, and then unzipping it up the landscape. So this is going to stop that unzipping and erosion. The way it works is basically, as you see, it really is a bowl. Similar practices, we'll start to hear these things over and over, like not stacking rocks on top of rocks, but the zuni bowl has a little bit more to it, a little more difficult to construct than some of the other practices or to design. But you'll see that the bottom of this line, as water is running into this structure, it then loses its velocity within this bowl. So basically it's taking out that energy from the stream, and these rocks around this area here that circle the bowl are going to allow vegetation to start to pop in. Again, we want that vegetation to do the work. We want the water to glide out of this structure. And then normally, almost always, your zuni bowl is going to be followed by one rock dam. So it's just that one extra redundant structure behind there to make sure you're protecting this area and creating the situation and the lower flow velocities that you're trying to accomplish with the zuni bowl.
Yeah, absolutely. And personally, I think zuni bowls are really beautiful, especially when water's flowing through them.
Yeah.
So they're an aesthetic choice for managing erosion.
It was very cool to see this flowing just a few days ago.
Yeah, I also think there's use cases for zuni bowls or zuni bowl type structures, even lower down in the in properties in areas that are not necessarily head cuts, but it's an infiltration feature. And I've seen clients in the past place zuni bowls where there are already kind of like natural depressions forming to protect that as an area where there's going to be in-soaking, and you have these little ephemeral wetland features that are coming over time.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Going back to the spectrum of these different land management practices or treatments, you know, putting berms and swales kind of on the far end of like more expensive, more expert level. Now we've got these different rock structures, one rock dams, rock rundowns, medialunas, and we've got these brush structures. So please let me know if you would agree that the brush structures are kind of easiest, most cost effective, cover the most ground the quickest, and then rocks would be kind of not that far down the spectrum from there.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And you know, just with anything, there's going to be pros and cons for each structure. Definitely the benefit for the brush structures is the resource to create them is abundant, especially in the hill country. They're very fast to make. You know, something like one of these brush medialunas that we see here, one of these brush mats, you know, could probably be constructed within a matter maybe of an hour with a few people and a chainsaw, where a rock structure, it's going to take you a long time to gather the rocks, or you might have to buy rocks to bring them in. It's pretty labor intensive to move them, but they really have this permanence on the landscape. So there's kind of that give and take with those two. As usual, you know, not one of them is better than the other. It just depends on your context and, you know, how it fits into your landscape and how it fits into the way that you're managing on your property and what's good for you.
And you were mentioning like soil temperature as well as something that you guys are measuring, and you were saying that you're seeing a real significant benefit to both the brush and the rock structures. Was there much of a difference between the two as far as soil temperature goes?
So as far as over in our demonstration area where we've had a rock rundown in place for a few years, and we've been able to, through one of our hottest summers we've ever had soil temperatures at 10 centimeters and 30 centimeters deep underneath those structures. And during the hottest days, we're able to see cooler temperatures under those rocks anywhere from 5 to 10 degrees. And that is a huge number when you're talking about preserving your soil microbiology, which has this relationship to keep your plants healthy and to build soil organic matter. Because once you start to get temperatures in your soil, say over 100 degrees, that microbiology starts to die. So if you're able to just keep it at 95 degrees or 90 degrees instead, that's a huge difference.
So under those rock structures might be like a refuge for microbiome biodiversity, which then once we get more rain again, those microbes can travel back out into the greater landscape potentially. Or if people have a big rocky field and they think like, oh man, that's the, you know, the ugliest, most difficult part of my land, maybe there could be some benefit there if there's soil underneath those rocks.
Yeah, and really another aspect of that, you're kind of leading right up to it, is just reducing that temperature. Perhaps there is an ugly part of a property where vegetation is struggling to grow, and a brush structure or rock structure might just remove that one stressor, that excess of heat that is needed to help, you know, spark that generation of some plant germination there. So, you know, that's kind of one aspect of that ecology is, can you just easily remove one of the stressors that is causing deterioration of that part of the landscape, and you can easily change that with possibly one of these structures. Yeah, I guess for anyone out there that has their own piece of property, maybe you're stewarding some land, taking care of it, maybe just one last thing to take away is to just get out there and to know your land, to learn about the geology there, to learn about the plants, to observe the patterns on it, to get out there during a rain event and see how water's flowing over it. And that could be one of the most important things you can do before making any decision, and just kind of apply some basic principles of protecting your soil by keeping living roots in the ground, aiming to have plant diversity, armoring your soil, you know, minimizing your soil disturbance, and gently slowing and spreading and sinking water, and I think you'll have some good results.
In reflection of today's events, I have taken several notes about things that I might be able to do to improve standard operating procedures, best practices. There's always something to learn. So I feel really grateful to have had the opportunity to be here and to see the research that the Edwards Aquifer Authority is doing, because there's not a lot of that research out there. I don't know how many people can say that they're even gathering any data about what berms and swales are doing, and I think that's important for like the broader landscape of ecosystem regeneration. Especially excited about these like low tech options that are very accessible to landowners, just moving around sticks and rocks and seeing like directly, just very empirically, the benefit of that. So yeah, just privileged to be able to witness both high-level data collection and then also just being able to observe with your own eyes how these simple techniques that have been used for a really long time are beneficial in our land management practices.
So I'd like to say how much I appreciate you guys coming out and taking interest in the work we're doing here. I know science can get kind of tedious and kind of boring to a lot of people a lot of times, and I certainly understand that, but we feel it's really necessary to understand the science behind what's going on here so that we can better manage the system, but maybe in the future we can incentivize some of these practices to the benefit of a more sustainable future for groundwater in South Texas. I guess if I was going to make one statement about a takeaway or a leave behind is, I just would love for everybody to understand the valuable component of our South Texas environment is water. Water is so important to us. Groundwater, surface water, rainwater. We all need to be cognizant of just how important water is to us every day. So thank you very much for your time and coming out.
All right, hey, thanks guys. Appreciate you watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you want to learn more about what we do, how we do it, why we do it, you can hop over to our website. There's tons of good articles. You can join our newsletter. You can follow us on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. We'd love to see you there and answer your questions. Thanks again. Enjoy.